Berent, thanks very much for accepting our invitation to come to the event. I'm particularly interested in your talk later, not only because I know the quality of your work, but also because you focus on something that's of a lot of interest for the average person: the nature of the autoimmune diseases in kids. Yeah? Can you tell us a little bit about the particular challenges that clinically one faces serving this population as opposed to grown-ups? Are there specific things in this population that make it more challenging?
Yeah, I think clinically there are clear differences from adults. First of all, because the disease hits the child during development. So very practically, for example, it affects growth of a child. It also affects the immune system. So we have some indications that, for example, anti-TNF therapy, which is very well tolerated in adults, gives far more problems in children. And you can imagine that because also the immune system is still developing. So if during this critical period you block a critical pathway for a long period, you can imagine that at some point you might end up being in more trouble. And just recently the FDA gave a warning that there is a black box warning even, that there's an increased risk of malignancies in children treated with anti-TNF treatment. Similarly, there are more risks of, for example, side effects which have to do with the fertility and other things. So there are some issues which are completely different from adults. Secondly, there's a second problem, is that although, for example, I'm going to talk about juvenile arthritis, although it looks in some ways like rheumatoid arthritis, actually in 90% of the cases the disease is completely different. And still we're forced to treat the children with the same medication as is developed for rheumatoid arthritis, which most probably is not completely optimal. So that's an additional challenge. An important point in this respect is that, of course, for example, pharmaceutical companies do not really spearhead the development of medication which is specifically developed for children. So we are always sort of balancing between trying to do as much as we can in solving the arthritis, and on the other hand, do not cause too much damage.
Is the feeling in the community, in the community interested in juvenile forms of the disease, does this community think that the therapies that are developed for adults will be equally helpful in kids, or is there the belief from the start, like, we shouldn't even go there and we should really design our clinical trials and do all of our work in this specific patient population, as opposed to just assuming that the kid is a small adult?
Well, I think, yeah, so that's a good point. Thinking that the kid is a small adult is wrong, and everybody who has children knows that's not the case. And not only for pure pharmacological reasons, but also for the fact that the disease is different. Like a good example, for example, IL-1 treatment is only moderately effective in rheumatoid arthritis, while a subtype of JIA, the systemic form of juvenile arthritis, is very well responsive to IL-1 treatment. So in some cases, it makes sense, of course, to develop a medication first in adults, but it sort of forgets the fact that the disease is different. For example, only 10% of the children with juvenile arthritis have the rheumatoid factor positive form of arthritis, which you can think is almost the same as rheumatoid arthritis. In other cases, the genetic background is different, the course of the disease is different, other joints are affected. So there are similarities, but there are also differences. And some recent work, for example, by Martin Offringa in Amsterdam, who's going to be in Toronto soon, showed also in a survey that because we use medication which is developed in adults for safety reasons mostly, and for economical reasons, but also because for safety reasons they are developed in adults, we end up having to treat children with like medication which is, and these are pretty shocking numbers, 80% of those medicines are not tested on safety and efficacy according to the rules which are in place for adults. So that's quite something. I'm talking about patients with those severe autoimmune diseases. So it's quite shocking numbers.
Yeah. So then it does sound like it would be in the best interest of the field to design their own trials in kids.
Yes.
But now, is there appetite from academics, from companies, from regulators to conduct this kind of trials, or that does because doing a trial in adults is already expensive, problematic. Is it much worse to do it in kids, or is there buying into the idea that this is the way to do it?
I think there's buying into the idea that this is the way to go, and thanks to the pediatric rule, which gives profits or an advantage for the companies to first try it, to also develop the medication for children. It's changing a little bit. And on the other hand, of course, for companies, they won't make a lot of money out of the pediatric medication themselves, but the good thing is that they get one additional year of patent protection, which is important. On the other hand, which is also important, that because the disease is relatively rare, the field of pediatric rheumatology and immunology has been very well organized, because we are used to do clinical trials together with many other groups. So there are some very good trial organizations that work closely together to get new drugs tested in children, both in the US and Canada and in the EU, and they work pretty well together. And they have been able to set up specific rules and specific guidelines for these type of trials in children. And there's a new initiative also, which comes from the Canadian government originally. It's called UCAN, which has now capitalizing on this by developing core facilities, core centers to do biological research in children. Because it's so rare, it's important to bring together all the expertise for certain assays, say biomarker assays, genetic testing, and do them in certain well-developed platforms for research.
Yeah, so the one thing that these trials have going for them, in addition to what you're saying, also then is presumably the size, so that you need relatively small trials because the conditions are more infrequent. Yeah. So one thing that I've been asking the other participants, and that I'd also like to hear your thoughts about, is the idea of magic bullets in the case of autoimmune diseases in general. Right, the interest of companies, of course, is to sell their drug to the largest number of patients, and it seems that some of them are aligning their discovery platforms along the lines of immune pathways as opposed to diseases. So it's a more transverse approach as opposed to the longitudinal approach they normally take. That may or may not work because the diseases may be sufficiently different, or it may work if there's something that's common to all of them. In your experience, having experience from looking at kids, which is sort of a special population, and in general from what you see in adults, do you find that this search for a drug that will target all the diseases at the same time is well founded, or do you think that it's a pipe dream?
I think that's not well founded. I think there are probably, especially for those diseases, there are many ways to get a disease. It's also not one magic bullet which causes the disease. At the same time, there's also not one bullet which will solve the disease. And there's one thing which is, I think, very important in this respect. What pediatric diseases, autoimmune diseases can learn us is because other than most of the other autoimmune diseases, like 30% of cases is self-remitting. So the disease goes into a complete remission, drug-free remission. And by studying that and trying to understand why some of those kids who have exactly the same type of disease go into complete remission and others do not, that may help us to identify mechanisms, probably not one. I would say there are multiple mechanisms, because that's the way how the immune system normally copes with inflammation. There will be multiple mechanisms which might help to solve the problem. I think in general that the way the companies are thinking now are really along the lines of suppressing immunity. And I would personally think that just suppressing is not going to do it. I think you have to look for active regulation at the same time. So maybe the way to go would be to first induce a remission of the disease and then try to regulate it. And there's another point. It's only one treatment, I think, that really has proven to really treat and cure, not really cure, but really at least temporarily cure very severe autoimmune disease, is autologous stem cell transplantation in children with severe forms of autoimmunity. So those were kids which were completely untreatable with any medication. After an autologous stem cell transplantation, for some reason, it was as if the clock was reset. We went back to the period before they got the disease. So they could even stop every medication, even no more non-steroidals. And I think it's very interesting to study why that happens. Of course, that's not the way to treat the disease because it goes far. It goes too far. But apparently, you can, and I think that's the biggest challenge. You have a genetic background. At some point, you develop the disease, and then you should try to go back to the period before you develop the disease. And apparently, there is a way back. How to do that? That will be the big challenge. But not one magic bullet. I would be very surprised. I would be happy, but very surprised.
Terrific. Well, I look forward to your talk later today, and thank you again for taking the time to come to participate in the conference.
I enjoy being here. Thank you so much for inviting me.